In this video, we're going to be taking a look at what is known as the dir function. And the dir function is a powerful inbuilt function that allows us to return a list of attributes and methods of any object. So this object could be a function, a module, it could be a string, list, dictionary, and so on. So the dir function tries to return a valid list of attributes of the object that it's called upon. Now, depending on the type of object that you pass into the dir function, it will behave differently, as it aims to produce the most relevant values for you. So for example, if I just call dir with a set of parentheses and then take a look at the docstring, you can see that if we call this function without an argument, it returns the names in the current scope. However, if we put something inside these parentheses, we get a list of the attributes of that given object. So for example, if we pass in a module object, we'll get the module's attributes. If we pass in a class object, we get its attributes and recursively the attributes of its bases. For any other object, we get its attributes, its class's attributes, and recursively the attributes of its class's base classes. Now this may sound confusing, but it will make complete sense by the end of this video. So if I start by printing out the result of calling upon the dir function, you can see that we get a list which contains the names that are available in the current local scope. So we have some special methods here like dunder doc dunder and dunder name dunder, which we'll actually cover in the next video, and then you'll also get some other names which we haven't covered yet. But what else could be included in the current scope? Well, let's just write some code and import some things into the current scope, as well as create an object in the current scope. So for this example, I will just import the math module by putting import math, and we'll also import the random module, so we can put import random. We will also create a variable called welcome, and we'll set this equal to the string hello. When we then print out what's returned when we call the dir function, you can now see that we get some extra names added to the list. You can see here we have the math module, you can see here we have the random module, and you can also see that we have our variable name called welcome at the end of this list. So when we call the dir function without passing in anything into the parentheses, we return a list of names in the current local scope. But what happens if we pass in an object into the parameters? Well, let's take a look. If we wanted to assess what we could call upon the welcome object, which we know is just a string object as it contains the word hello, if I put welcome, place a dot, and then press the tab key, you can see we get a list of methods and attributes that we could call upon this object. So we could call upon capitalize, ends with, index, isDigit, and so on. And this is great if you're using Jupyter Notebook. But if you're not using Jupyter Notebook, you won't have this luxury. So if I were to print and then call upon the dir function and pass in the welcome object, you can see here that we get a list returned which contains a list of names of all the attributes contained in that module. So you can see we have capitalize, we have ends with, isDigit, replace, split, everything that we would see when we press dot and then access the attributes and methods of that specific object. So a very useful way of being able to look up what you can do with that specific object. If I were to pass in the random module into the dir function, you can see we once again get a list of names of all the attributes contained in that module. So you may recognize the choice method and the randint method that we've used in the course so far. And how about if we pass in a user-defined class object with an available dir method passed in as the parameter? Well, let's take a look. Firstly, we'll create an example class. So we'll put class and we'll call this class supermarket. We'll then put def dunder init dunder, pass in self, and the second parameter will be in reference to store. We can then create an instance attribute where we put self.store equals store, so whatever is passed in when creating an instance of this class. And we'll then define a method called customer_name, in which we'll pass in self. We'll create a variable called name, and we'll set this equal to the input function stating what is your name. we will then print welcome to, then we will plus self.store, then we will plus an empty space, and then we will plus the name variable which stores that input when the user calls upon that method. We can then put def dunder dir dunder and then pass in self. Now, seeing as we only have one method that the user could call upon this class object called supermarket, we will simply return a list, and inside this list we'll pass in the reference to the method name, so customer_name, and then we can pass in a second attribute which we know we've created in the init method, so we can also put store. Okay, so far so good, very simple. All we've done is created a user-defined class object and utilized Python's dunder dir dunder magic method, which will implement the functionality of the dir function when it's called upon from our class object. So if we quickly create an instance of this class, so if we create a variable called example, and we set this equal to a call upon the supermarket class, and inside the parentheses, which we know takes in one argument, we put the store name Asda. If I now put example dot and then press tab, you can see that we get the attributes and methods listed to the screen, and for this object we're able to access customer_name as well as store. So if I put example.customer_name and call upon this method by placing parentheses, and then underneath this line simply print out a call on the dir function and pass in the object example, which we know is an instance of our supermarket class, you can see we're first of all asked, what is your name? So for this example, we'll just put Lisa. You can then see that we get printed to the screen, welcome to Asda, Lisa. And underneath we print out a list of the names of the valid attributes and methods that we have available in this class, and you can see we have customer_name, and we also have an attribute called store. So the dir function is very powerful in assessing what we have at our fingertips with respect to the attributes and methods and things we can do with specific objects. It can be used with various use cases, and it's usually used for debugging purposes in just day-to-day programs. With the capability of listing out all the attributes of the parameter that's passed in, it's really useful when handling a lot of classes and functions separately. And seeing as the dir function can also list out all of the available attributes for a module or another object like a list or dictionary, it also gives us information on the operations that we can perform for that specific object, which can be so useful when we have little to no information about a specific module, which then helps us get to know that new module a lot faster. So be sure to keep the dir function in the back of your mind when you want to know what you can do with specific objects.